Nada Jane Colita was someone who left a lasting impression on everyone who crossed her path. Born into a close-knit family in Sydney, she was known for her gentle nature and bright, hopeful spirit. From a young age, she showed a strong sense of compassion and an eagerness to help others. Friends described her as someone who listened without judgment and always had a kind word, even when things weren't easy for her. Her dreams weren't complicated or flashy. She hoped to build a stable future, one where she could look after her loved ones and grow into a strong, independent woman. The neighborhood where Nada lived felt like a safe and peaceful pocket of the city. The streets were quiet most of the time, lined with tidy houses and well-kept gardens. People who had grown up there spoke warmly about their surroundings as a place where you could take an evening walk without fear and where most families had lived for years. Children played in front yards, and familiar faces waved from verandas as if life followed a steady rhythm. Nothing about this place suggested that one of its own would be at the center of a devastating crime. Nada embraced this calm atmosphere as part of her daily life. Her routine was simple and comforting. Every morning, she woke up with a sense of purpose, whether it was going to work or making time for those she cared about most. Her friendships ran deep, especially with a few close friends who had been there for her through all kinds of ups and downs. They admired her strength and honesty, and often spoke of her quiet resilience and inner power that didn't need to be announced, because it was clear in the way she faced every obstacle. Yet beneath the surface of this tranquil life, there were signs that not everything was as perfect as it appeared. Nada had begun to feel an unfamiliar tension in her days, a sense that someone was watching or that she couldn't fully let her guard down. Occasionally, she confided in people she trusted, mentioning small incidents that left her unsettled, a strange phone call that had no voice on the other end, someone lingering too long near her street. At first, these were brushed off as coincidences, things that could happen to anyone in a big city. But as time went on, they began to seem less like random events and more like the pieces of a troubling puzzle. Still, Nada refused to live in fear. Her hopes for the future kept her grounded. Whether it was planning a new course at work or talking about dreams of traveling abroad one day, she kept moving forward. Friends admired her determination, especially because they knew she had worked hard to stand on her own 2 feet. Life had never handed her anything on a silver platter. Every milestone she reached was the result of her commitment and strength of character. Yet even those who loved Nada most couldn't have imagined how fragile that sense of security truly was. Beneath the calm surroundings and everyday routines was a reality nobody could have prepared for. Small details that had been overlooked at the time would soon come into sharper focus. They would tell a troubling story of warning signs and missed connections, a story that only began to make sense after it was too late. And as investigators would later discover, the path that led to Nada's final moments had been winding its way toward her for some time. Nothing about the face she showed to the world hinted at the dangers that were drawing near, and nobody could have guessed just how close those dangers already were. What happened in the days and hours before everything changed would reveal a darker side to the quiet world she thought she knew so well. Welcome to I'm a Detective. We break down real criminal cases, digging into evidence, timelines, and the disturbing details others overlook. If you're into true crime that's fact-based, emotional, and gripping, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button too. Join the investigation. The morning began like most others. The skies were bright and still, with just a light breeze stirring the leaves outside. Nada moved through her usual routine, preparing for the day ahead with the quiet focus that those around her had come to appreciate. Nothing in those early hours gave any hint of what was to come. She checked her messages, got dressed, and stepped out into the world with the same sense of calm that had guided her every other day. It was a morning like countless others before it, but this one would not end the way anyone could have imagined. As the hours passed and the morning turned into afternoon, everyday life unfolded all around her. Neighbors ran their usual errands, cars poured in and out of driveways. The neighborhood remained its typical self, mostly uneventful, mostly safe. Nada had things on her list to complete, people to see, and places to go. Throughout the day, nothing stood out as truly alarming. If someone had paused to look more closely, they might have noticed a tension hidden just below the surface of these simple movements: a slight glance over the shoulder, an unsettled gaze at someone standing a bit too long on the street corner. But for most people, these small signs would have been easy to overlook. By mid-afternoon, the light had begun to shift. Shadows grew longer and stretched across the pavement. It was that quiet part of the day when most people slow their pace before the evening, when the streets grow less busy. Nada went about her business, finishing up what she had set out to do. Throughout the neighborhood, nobody suspected that these were the last few ordinary hours they would share with her. The world outside continued as if it could go on forever in the same gentle rhythm. Yet as the sun lowered, a darker sense of unease began to creep into the edges of the day. When evening finally arrived, a stillness settled in the neighborhood. The sky was painted with deep blue and soft purple tones. Streetlights glowed faintly, their light creating pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but as the hour grew later, an eerie quiet filled the spaces between houses. Windows glimmered, curtains moved slightly as people peeked outside at the night. A sense of hesitation began to hang in the air, as if everyone somehow sensed that something was wrong but couldn't yet put their finger on it. It wasn't long before that quiet was shattered. At some point during those dark hours, a tragic event unfolded that would forever mark this place. The exact moment it happened is one that would be reconstructed piece by piece, but at that time, there was only confusion. A sound had broken the silence, something sharp and sudden that caused people to freeze. In the moments after, an overwhelming sense of fear began to spread when help finally arrived on the scene. The officers stepping through the door could hardly believe what they were seeing. Nothing could have prepared them for the sight that greeted them inside. The house was still, but there were signs of a struggle that spoke of a terrible encounter. Every detail was noted carefully as they moved through the rooms. Scattered belongings, a door left partly open, and the unmistakable feeling that whoever had been there last had left in a terrible hurry. The most heartbreaking discovery was Nada herself, who was found motionless, surrounded by signs of a violent attack that had ended her life far too soon. As neighbors learned what had happened, a hush fell over the entire street. Lights turned on in house after house, and people stood on their porches, looking toward the scene. Some tried to catch a glimpse, their hands pressed against their mouths in shock. Parents pulled children inside and closed their doors quickly. Even those who didn't know Nada personally felt the weight of the tragedy, sensing that their own sense of safety had been shattered forever. The questions began immediately. How could something so terrible happen here? Who would do such a thing? And most frightening of all, was that person still out there somewhere? The days that followed would be filled with tension. Police moved quickly, sealing off the area and collecting every trace of evidence they could find. Investigators searched carefully for fingerprints, signs of forced entry, or any clue that could explain what had happened. Even as they worked, they felt the eyes of the community on them. Every face tense with worry, every person hoping that whoever was responsible would be found before they could strike again. People began to speak in hushed tones in cafes and shops, wondering if they had overlooked anything that could help. Details that had seemed insignificant before a strange car seen parked late at night, an unfamiliar figure lurking near a corner store, now took on a new and troubling meaning. Fear crept into every part of daily life. Every sound after dark, every knock at the door after sunset was enough to make hearts race. And through it all, the question remained, unspoken yet present in every thought: who had taken Nada's life, and why? That question would lead to an intense search for answers that nobody could have anticipated. The hunt was only beginning, and what they would discover would shake the entire community to its core. In the first few hours after the terrible discovery, police moved quickly to control the scene. Officers spoke quietly to those who had gathered outside, careful not to give too much away too soon. Every tiny detail of the house was photographed and logged. Investigators searched for anything that might help them understand what had happened, from stray footprints in the dirt to the slightest mark on a doorframe. They worked methodically, but even as they gathered evidence, they felt the pressure mounting. The entire neighborhood was waiting for answers. The first days of the investigation focused on Nada's inner circle. Police began by looking at those who had been closest to her family, friends, SEAL workers. They hoped to find someone who had witnessed anything strange, someone who had seen her last. Detectives knew from experience that the answers to violent crimes often lay close to home, hidden in the relationships of the victim's daily life. The idea was heartbreaking, but it was a starting point they could not ignore. As interviews began, small bits of information emerged. Some described Nada as careful and independent, someone who rarely spoke about personal troubles. Others remembered seeing a familiar face visit her home more than once that week. Rumors began to spread that someone close to her had shown too much interest in her private affairs, or that an argument had happened recently. Police followed up on every lead, hoping one of them would reveal a clear motive. But most of these hints led nowhere. The more they searched, the more it seemed like they were chasing shadows. The sense of unease deepened as early suspects were brought in for questioning. Some were acquaintances who had crossed paths with Nada recently. Others were people who had been near her neighborhood around the time of the crime. Police carefully questioned each one, comparing their stories, checking their alibis. Yet every time they hoped they had found the right person, their suspicions fell apart under closer examination. Either the evidence did not fit, or someone else could prove they were nowhere near the scene. What had looked like a promising lead would vanish into nothing. Meanwhile, tension in the community kept rising. Every day that passed without a breakthrough added to the fear that whoever was responsible might still be nearby. Neighbors whispered to one another, speculating about strangers they had noticed recently. Even casual remarks took on a new weight. Every small rumor was examined by those hoping to make sense of what had happened. The atmosphere felt tense and restless, as though everyone was looking over their shoulder inside the police station. Detectives felt the same strain. Days turned into a blur of long hours, phone calls, and carefully tracked timelines. The case file on Nada grew larger, full of witness statements and photographs, but there was still no clear suspect. Investigators were frustrated, knowing that time was working against them. Every passing hour increased the risk that the trail would go cold forever. Still, they pushed onward, determined to leave nothing unchecked. There were moments when a new lead would emerge and briefly give them hope. Perhaps someone had seen a suspicious figure near the street that night. Maybe a phone record hinted at an unfamiliar number calling her just before everything happened. But every path they followed ran into obstacles. Sometimes there was no proof the caller had any connection to the crime. Other times, people who thought they had seen someone unfamiliar could not give enough detail to make a real identification. It felt like they were navigating a maze without an exit. One dead end after another. As the days stretched into weeks, the sense of sadness in the neighborhood deepened. Nada's face was everywhere, on posters appealing for information and in the memories of those who had cared about her. Even those who never met her felt her absence like a hole torn into the fabric of their daily lives. Every evening, as the light began to fade, people paused a little longer before turning their keys, checking their windows one more time before going to sleep. The knowledge that someone could do something so terrible and disappear without a trace made everyone feel exposed. And as the investigation went on, one question kept pressing into everyone's thoughts. If the police, with all their resources, couldn't find who was responsible, what hope was there that they ever would? The real culprit was still out there, hidden in plain sight, and the search for the truth was only becoming more complicated. With every passing day, the fear that justice might never come was beginning to grow, but the determination to find answers remained strong. Investigators were not ready to give up, even as the trail continued to twist and turn into darkness. For weeks, it felt like the trail had gone cold. Every avenue had been explored, every possible suspect ruled out. Officers had spent long days and sleepless nights going over the smallest pieces of evidence again and again. Nada's family had begun to fear they might never have the answers they deserved. The entire neighborhood was losing faith, certain that whoever was responsible had disappeared forever into the shadows. But just when it seemed the case had stalled completely, something small and overlooked finally shattered them. Silence. It was a simple clue, a tiny detail that had been sitting unnoticed in plain sight. Deep in the pile of collected items from Nada's home, forensic examiners uncovered a trace that had escaped everyone's attention before. Beneath careful lighting and under the microscope, they recognized it for what it was. A single hair that didn't match Nada's nor anyone who had been questioned so far. That tiny thread held the potential to change everything. Once tested, its DNA profile would act like a beacon in the dark. Investigators sent it for rapid analysis, and as they waited, tension filled the air. Police hoped it would lead them straight to someone connected to the crime. Nada's family felt a surge of cautious relief, sensing for the first time that the terrible waiting might soon come to an end. When the results finally came back, they took even experienced officers by surprise. The DNA belonged to someone who had never been seriously suspected before, a person who had blended into everyday life so easily that nobody had thought to look their way. The shock ran deep. Investigators struggled to believe that someone who seemed so unremarkable could be tied to something so terrible, and with that discovery, a new sense of urgency took hold. Police moved quickly, gathering additional evidence to make sure they were on the right track. They checked phone records, travel histories, and financial transactions. Every new fact pointed to this one individual, making it harder and harder to see their past actions as innocent or coincidental. Slowly, a darker picture began to form, suggesting careful planning and a motive nobody had seen before. The emotional impact was immediate and powerful. Nada's family, who had spent endless nights wondering if they would ever have justice, felt a mixture of heartbreak and relief. Heartbreak at learning someone they had trusted could have been capable of such cruelty. Relief at knowing that the end of their long search was finally in sight. Police felt the weight of those emotions too. Every officer involved had grown close to this case, touched by the depth of loss and the lingering fear in the neighborhood. Now that they had a real lead, they knew they couldn't make a single mistake. As they prepared to act, a strange silence fell over the community. People sensed that something important was about to happen, and they spoke in careful whispers about what might come next. The question everyone had been too scared to say aloud was finally about to have an answer. But even as investigators moved closer to making an arrest, they kept most of what they knew hidden. They needed to be sure. They had to catch their suspect before he had a chance to run or hide the evidence forever. Every second counted as they followed the trail deeper, hoping that one small hair was enough to put together the puzzle nobody had been able to solve. And while the world around them went on as usual, shops stayed open, cars passed by, and people walked home under the fading light of the day. Those involved in the case felt like they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Nothing would ever feel quite the same after this. The most troubling part was knowing that they had all overlooked someone who had been nearby all along. What would come to light next would leave everyone shaken and forever change the way they thought about their safety, their neighbors, and the true meaning of justice. With every new lead they uncovered, investigators felt the picture becoming clearer. The DNA result was just the first in a series of revelations that none of them had expected. Within days, they had focused their attention on one individual who had kept an alarmingly low profile throughout the entire investigation. That person was someone who had crossed paths with Nada more often than anyone realized. Someone who had skillfully stayed under the radar by blending into the background of daily life. As they dug deeper into this person's history, troubling details began to emerge. They were someone who had nurtured a secret fixation, a troubling mix of unhealthy fascination and jealousy that had grown stronger over time. Investigators learned that what had begun as a simple attraction had twisted into an obsession that the perpetrator had hidden for years. Behind their polite smiles and calm appearance was a tangled web of resentment and personal insecurity. They had watched Nada's successes and friendships from a distance, wishing they could be part of her world, but feeling forever on the outside. More than anything, they had envied her sense of purpose, her close connections with family and friends, and the way she moved through life with quiet confidence. It wasn't something they had consciously decided to resent at first. It had built slowly, like a small seed that took root and spread over time. Every kind word Nada gave, every plan she spoke about, felt like a reminder of the emptiness they had never been able to fill in their own life. That sense of inadequacy festered until it became a dark and overpowering need to control the one person who seemed so free.
And so, in the days leading up to the tragedy, they began making their move. Investigators eventually uncovered careful preparations, changes in routine, lingering visits close to her home, and attempts to hide any evidence of their obsession. They had created an image for themselves that was nothing like the reality. They kept carefully locked away, allowing them to hide in plain sight as someone who could never possibly do any harm. When police finally had enough evidence to act, they moved quickly to take the perpetrator into custody. For everyone who heard the news, it was like a shockwave that passed through the entire community. Even those who had never suspected anything felt shaken. This was someone who had appeared so ordinary, so unremarkable, that nobody could have guessed what they were capable of. Nothing had ever hinted at the depth of their resentment or the tragic path they had taken to make that resentment known. As the truth became public, the ripple effects were felt everywhere. Family, friends, and neighbors who had never doubted this person before were left wondering what they had missed. Police themselves, hardened by years on the job, spoke about the case with a sense of disbelief at how someone could hide their true nature so well. The arrest was a relief, but it left a lingering sadness that went beyond justice being served. Nada's loved ones had long hoped for this moment of clarity, yet the reality was harder than they imagined. Learning that someone who had been part of their wider world could cause such pain was a bitter burden to carry. Even as they began to feel some sense of closure, they also felt a new grief at the senselessness of it all, and for everyone who had followed this story from a distance. The most troubling part was knowing that someone can appear so unthreatening and yet hide such dangerous thoughts. It was a reminder that evil rarely announces itself in obvious ways. Often, it exists alongside the familiar, beneath the surface of the everyday, waiting for its own moment to strike. That terrible secret had finally been brought into the light, and though it was painful to see, it meant the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Justice was moving forward, but the impact of what had happened would continue to echo long after the last report was filed. Nothing would ever be quite the same again, because what had been revealed was more than a single tragedy. It was a heartbreaking glimpse into the shadows that can exist behind even the most familiar faces. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with a tense, almost silent energy. Every seat was taken as people gathered to hear the details they had been fearing for so long. Prosecutors built a careful case, presenting every piece of evidence they had gathered. Photographs, DNA reports, and forensic findings were displayed in order, making it impossible to deny the perpetrator's role. Investigators explained the small clues they had uncovered and how those clues led directly to the accused. Piece by piece, the story of what happened that terrible night was told, each fact bringing them closer to understanding the full, heartbreaking picture. Nada's loved ones sat through it all with quiet strength. They had waited so long to see someone held responsible for her loss, yet they also felt the weight of hearing every painful detail spoken aloud in a public space. Community members came too, hoping to see justice delivered and hoping that what they heard would help them make sense of an event that had changed so many lives forever. When the time came for impact statements, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Even more, family and friends shared their memories of Nada and spoke about what her absence had left behind. They talked about who she was, a kind and caring soul who had loved and been loved in return, and how deeply they had felt the loss. Every word was a reminder that this was more than a case file or an article. It was a life that mattered. People from the neighborhood also stepped forward to say how the tragedy had shaken their sense of safety. Parents spoke of holding their children closer. Neighbors spoke of locking their doors more carefully at night. Even those who had never met Nada felt her story had changed them forever. The courtroom was hushed as they spoke, every listener feeling the deep sadness that ran through each voice. When the verdict was finally announced, a sense of solemn relief settled over everyone present. The accused was found guilty and faced a long prison sentence. Justice, at last, had been delivered, but those who had followed the case closely knew that a simple verdict could never fully erase what had been lost. The years of pain that Nada's family had endured would never truly disappear. Even with the trial concluded, they understood that moving on was a slow, careful process that would take a lifetime. After the trial, the focus shifted from the courtroom back to the memories of Nada herself. Her loved ones began to speak more publicly about the kind of person she had been, making sure that nobody ever thought of her as just a name in a case file. Friends organized tributes in her honor. Photographs were displayed at local community centers and places that had been special to her. Charitable events were held, encouraging people to support causes Nada would have cared about. Every one of these acts was a way to keep her spirit alive, to make sure that her light was never forgotten. And across the neighborhood, people took their own small steps to remember her too. Some left flowers outside her home on important dates. Others spoke about her when they gathered together, sharing stories that reflected her gentle, hopeful nature. Even those who had never known her felt inspired to look after one another more closely, to stay a little more aware, and to care a little more deeply. That was perhaps the most powerful legacy Nada left behind. Even after the legal process was over, her story continued to matter because it showed everyone that compassion, safety, and empathy must never be taken for granted. It also showed how a single person's life could touch so many others and leave a lasting impression. Long after the verdict was read and the courtroom doors had closed, Nada Jane Kalita was still remembered. The sadness of losing her would never go away entirely, but in that sadness was also a quiet, hopeful resolve to do better and to be better. It was a gentle reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, people could come together, support one another, and make sure that a beautiful soul is never truly forgotten.